On the 22nd of May 1992, Johnny Carson whispered 12 words into Bette Midler's ear that would change both of their lives forever. The cameras couldn't pick it up. The microphones weren't positioned to catch it. But 20 million people watching at home saw Bette's face transform from joy to shock to something that looked like devastation and purpose combined. What Johnny said in that moment wasn't a joke or a sentimental goodbye. It was a confession so massive that when his lawyers finally revealed the full scope years later, it would shock the entire entertainment industry and save thousands of lives. But here's what nobody knew that night. Johnny had been planning this moment for exactly 2 years. And the reason why would break your heart. To understand why those 12 words shattered Bette Midler and set in motion a legacy that's still saving lives today, you need to know what was happening behind Johnny's famous smile that final night. The lights in Studio One were dimming for the very last time, but Johnny Carson wasn't savoring the moment like everyone assumed. He was staring at a single empty seat in the third row, a chair that had been vacant since the 21st of June 1990. That was the day his son Rick lost his life in a car accident on a winding California road, and nothing had been the same since. For 2 years, Johnny had shown up to that desk every single night and made America laugh while his own heart was in pieces. Every night, his eyes would find that empty chair without effort. A silent ritual no camera ever caught. The audience had no idea. The producers didn't know what it meant. But Johnny knew. That seat was supposed to be for Rick, a permanent invitation to the son who would never sit in it again. In that emptiness lived a grief so consuming that Johnny had built his entire final 2 years around hiding it from the world. And here's what makes it even more devastating. That empty chair was just the visible part of Johnny's secret. What he was carrying inside his tuxedo jacket that night would have made headlines around the world if anyone had known about it. Behind the curtain that last night, Johnny stood with his hands shoved deep in his pockets to hide the tremor no one was supposed to see. Ed McMahon stood nearby, trying to keep the energy light with his trademark laugh, but even Ed could feel something was different tonight. Johnny wasn't just nervous about the finale. He was preparing to do something he'd never done in 30 years of television. He was preparing to tell someone the truth, not the polished, camera-ready version of truth that plays well in interviews. The raw, jagged truth that had been eating him alive for 2 years. But why Bette Midler? Why choose her, of all the celebrities and friends he could have trusted? The answer to that question reveals just how carefully Johnny had planned this entire evening. The producers buzzed around him with their headsets and clipboards, running through the timing one last time. Commercial breaks at exactly the right moments. Bette Midler's song timed to the second. The final monologue carefully crafted for maximum emotional impact. Everything had been planned with military precision. But they had no idea that Johnny was about to go completely off script in a way that would haunt Bette Midler for the rest of her life. He'd asked her to be on the show tonight for a very specific reason, and it had nothing to do with singing a song or getting laughs or providing a memorable finale for the fans. Johnny had chosen Bette because she was one of the few people in Hollywood he trusted completely. Over the years, they developed a friendship that went beyond the transactional relationships that defined most of show business. She'd been there during his divorces. She'd called him after Rick passed away, when most celebrities had sent generic condolence cards and moved on with their lives. She understood grief because she'd experienced her own devastating losses. More importantly, she understood discretion in an industry built on gossip. Johnny knew that what he was about to ask her would require both strength and absolute secrecy, and Bette Midler was one of the only people he knew who possessed both qualities. But even she had no idea what was coming. Even she couldn't have predicted what Johnny was about to hand her. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Johnny took a breath and stepped through the curtain one last time. The audience roared, a wall of sound and love that should have felt triumphant but instead felt crushing. He moved to the desk on autopilot, his body remembering the choreography even as his mind raced ahead to the moment he'd been dreading all night. The monologue went by in a blur. He hit his marks. He delivered the punchlines with perfect timing. The audience laughed in all the right places. But part of Johnny was watching from a distance, observing this final performance like a stranger attending his own funeral. And tucked inside his jacket pocket was a photograph he'd been carrying for 2 years straight. a picture that had never left his body since the day Rick departed. What was in that photograph? That detail becomes crucial to understanding what happened next. He thought about the first time he'd sat behind this desk in 1962, young and hungry and convinced he could make it work. He thought about the 10,000 nights since then, each one a small miracle of timing and wit and the careful management of America's expectations. He'd tucked millions of people into bed with a joke and a wink, had become such a fixture of American life that entire generations couldn't imagine nighttime without him. But what had it cost? What had he sacrificed to become an icon? As he looked out at the audience one more time, he knew the answer. He'd sacrificed the ability to grieve his own son in public. He'd sacrificed the right to fall apart when his world collapsed. He'd sacrificed his privacy and his peace for the sake of the show. And now, finally, he was going to take something back. The monologue ended. The commercial break came and went, and then Bette Midler walked onto the stage, and Johnny felt his heart start to hammer in his chest. This was it. The moment that would either free him or destroy him. And he wasn't entirely sure which outcome he was hoping for. Bette approached the desk with a warmth that seemed to fill the studio. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to witness, to hold space for whatever was about to happen. As she settled into the chair next to him, Johnny saw understanding in her eyes. She knew this wasn't going to be a normal interview. What she didn't know was that in less than 20 minutes, Johnny would ask her to guard a secret worth $400 million. They made small talk for a few minutes, the easy banter of old friends who'd been through this routine 100 times before. The audience laughed. The band played. Everything looked normal on the surface. But underneath, Johnny was gathering his courage for what came next. He'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head, lying awake at 3 in the morning in his Malibu house, staring at the ceiling and trying to find the words. Now that the moment was here, his mouth felt dry and his hands felt cold, and he wondered if he'd actually be able to go through with it. Then Bette began to sing, and everything changed. One for my baby and one more for the road filled the studio, her voice carrying all the melancholy and tenderness the moment required. Johnny sat perfectly still, his chin resting on his hand in that familiar pose. But inside, he was coming apart. The lyrics spoke of loneliness and long nights and the stories we tell ourselves to survive, and every word felt like it had been written specifically for this moment. As Bette sang, Johnny's mind drifted to Rick, to the last conversation they'd had before the accident, to all the things he'd meant to say but never got around to the terrible, permanent silence that had replaced his son's voice, and to the project he'd started exactly 3 months after Rick was gone, a secret mission that had consumed every spare moment of the last 2 years. The song built to its emotional crescendo, and Johnny felt tears starting to form. For the first time in 30 years, he didn't fight them. He let them come. The audience watched in stunned silence as the most controlled man in television began to crack. When Bette hit the final note, holding it with a trembling power that seemed to shake the rafters, Johnny knew he was out of time. The decision had been made. He was going to do this thing he'd been planning for months, this act of trust and desperation that would change everything. If you're wondering what Johnny had been building in secret for 2 years, stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see his entire career. The song ended. The audience erupted into applause that seemed to last forever. Bette didn't turn to acknowledge them. She stayed focused on Johnny, her eyes searching his face with concern. She could see he was barely holding it together. As the applause began to fade, Johnny leaned forward slightly, and Bette instinctively leaned in to meet him. The cameras captured the moment but couldn't hear what happened next. In the space between heartbeats, Johnny Carson whispered 12 words that stopped time. "I'm giving it all away. Please help me do it right." Bette's eyes widened. Her hand flew to her mouth. For a moment, she looked like she might cry or faint or both. The audience saw her reaction and assumed it was part of the emotion of the evening, a touching moment between old friends saying goodbye. They had no idea they were witnessing the exact moment Johnny Carson handed over his entire fortune and his entire legacy to someone else. No idea that those 12 words represented a decision so massive it would reshape both of their lives. But what was Johnny giving away? And why did he need Bette's help to do it? The answer involves 43 children who would be gone if not for Johnny's secret project. Before Bette could respond, before she could ask what he meant or whether he was serious, Johnny continued in a rushed whisper that the microphones still couldn't catch. He told her about the envelope in his desk drawer. He told her about the meeting scheduled for tomorrow with his lawyers. He told her that for the past 2 years, since the moment Rick lost his life, he'd been quietly building something that mattered more to him than anything else in his entire career. And now he needed her help to see it through because he couldn't do it alone anymore. The weight was crushing him. The secrecy was ending his life from the inside out. He needed someone to share the burden, and he'd chosen her. Bette nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Johnny squeezed her hand once before pulling back and turning to face the cameras one last time. The rest of the show passed in a blur. The final guests, the final jokes, the final wave to the audience. But Johnny's mind was already elsewhere, already moving toward the future he'd been planning in secret. When the cameras finally cut for the last time and Studio One erupted in celebration, Johnny slipped away to his dressing room without saying goodbye to anyone. He sat at his mirror, still wearing the tuxedo, and pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. This was what he'd told Bette about. Inside were documents that would stagger her when she finally read them. Legal papers that outlined a plan so audacious, so completely unprecedented that even his own lawyers had tried to talk him out of it. But first, Bette had to find him, and what she was about to learn in that dressing room would haunt her in the most beautiful way possible for the rest of her life. Johnny heard a soft knock at the door and called for her to enter. Bette stepped inside, her makeup streaked with tears, still wearing the gown she'd performed in. She looked at Johnny and saw not the king of late night, but a man who'd just laid down the heaviest burden of his life. The mask was completely gone now. The performance was over. This was just Johnny from Nebraska, scared and grieving and desperate for help. "Tell me," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. So Johnny told her everything, and what he revealed in the next 10 minutes would explain why he'd really retired at the height of his success. He told her that the day Rick passed away, something had broken inside him that would never be repaired. He told her about the rage and the guilt and the desperate, consuming need to make the loss mean something. He told her that he'd spent 2 years trying to process the grief, while still showing up to make millions of people laugh, and it had nearly ended him. The only thing that had kept him functional was a project he'd started 3 months after Rick's passing, a secret mission that gave his pain a purpose. Johnny had quietly established a foundation with an initial investment of $5 million from his personal fortune. The foundation had one goal: to ensure that no parent would ever have to watch their child pass away because they couldn't afford medical care. He'd partnered with a children's hospital in Los Angeles, working through intermediaries to maintain complete anonymity. The foundation paid for experimental treatments, clinical trials, medications that insurance wouldn't cover, and all the small dignities that make a hospital room bearable. In 2 years, operating in absolute secrecy, Johnny's foundation had saved 43 children's lives. 43 kids who would be gone if not for the money Johnny poured into their treatments. But that was just the beginning. What Johnny was about to tell Bette next would make her gasp out loud. Bette listened in stunned silence as Johnny explained the scope of what he'd built. The foundation employed a small staff who had no idea who funded their work. They thought the money came from a consortium of anonymous donors. Johnny had made sure his name appeared nowhere on any documents. He didn't want credit or recognition or headlines about his generosity. He wanted to save children because he couldn't save his own son, and he wanted to do it without turning grief into a publicity opportunity. He wanted it pure, untainted by celebrity or ego or the machinery of fame that had consumed his entire adult life. Bette was crying openly now, but Johnny wasn't finished. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a document that made her legs go weak. The papers he handed Bette contained a provision that would transfer his entire estate to the foundation upon his passing. Not part of it, not half, all of it. Every single dollar he'd earned in 30 years of television would eventually go towards saving children's lives. The lawyers estimated his estate would be worth somewhere between $300 and $400 million by the time he departed. That money would create an endowment large enough to save thousands of lives in perpetuity. It would be his real legacy, the thing he wanted to be remembered for when the jokes were forgotten and the reruns stopped playing. But there was one more piece to the plan, and this was where Bette came in. Johnny looked at her with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "I need you to be the face of it," he said, his voice cracking. "When I'm gone, I need you to tell people why this exists. I need you to make sure it doesn't pass away with me." He explained that he was too private to run the foundation publicly while he was alive. The scrutiny would be unbearable. The questions about Rick would reopen wounds that barely held together. Every interview would become about his loss. Every story would dissect his grief for entertainment. He couldn't survive that. He'd barely survived the last 2 years as it was. But Bette could do what he couldn't. She could be public. She could advocate. She could use her platform to make sure the foundation grew instead of being forgotten. She could be the bridge between his private grief and the public good that could come from it. And here's what she didn't know yet. Johnny had already written her into his will as the foundation's public executor. He'd made the decision 6 months earlier. But this was the first time he'd told her. Bette was shaking now, understanding the magnitude of what Johnny was asking. He wasn't just asking her to manage a charity. He was asking her to become the keeper of his grief, the translator of his pain into something beautiful. He was trusting her with the most important thing he'd ever done, the only thing that had kept him alive after Rick was lost. "Why me?" she asked, her voice breaking into pieces. Johnny smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face into something younger and more vulnerable. "Because you understand. Because you understand," he said simply. "Because you won't make it about me. You'll make it about them, the kids. That's all I care about. They're the only thing that matters now." He told her about the playroom he'd designed for the hospital's oncology ward, a circus-themed space with a small stage where sick children could perform magic tricks and tell jokes. He'd spent months planning every detail, working late at night after tapings to sketch out designs and write specifications. He'd written hundreds of jokes on index cards for the kids, simple, silly humor that could make a child laugh despite everything they were going through. But the detail that made Bette completely break down was what Johnny said next. He told her about the letters he received from parents whose children had been saved by his foundation. Letters sent to his lawyer, who forwarded them with all identifying information removed to protect Johnny's anonymity. Letters he kept in a locked drawer at home and read when the grief became too heavy. Those letters were the only thing that made his son's passing feel like anything other than a meaningless tragedy. "I read them every night," Johnny whispered. "Every single night before bed. And for just a few minutes, I can breathe again. I can feel like maybe Rick's loss wasn't completely pointless. Maybe some good can come from it. Maybe I can save the sons that other fathers are about to lose." He pulled out one of the letters and handed it to Bette with trembling fingers. It was from a mother in Los Angeles whose 6-year-old daughter had been facing the end from leukemia. The insurance had run out. The treatments were experimental and cost $60,000. They'd been preparing to say goodbye. Then someone from a foundation they'd never heard of called and said the treatment was covered. Everything was covered. "Just bring your daughter in tomorrow." 3 years later, that little girl was cancer-free and starting 4th grade. The mother had written to thank the anonymous donors who'd saved her daughter's life, and somehow the letter had found its way to Johnny. Bette read through tears that wouldn't stop coming. When she finished, she looked up at Johnny and saw that he was crying too, silently, the tears running down his face unchecked. "After tonight, I'm disappearing," Johnny said quietly. "No interviews, no appearances, nothing public. I'm going to spend whatever time I have left working on this. But I can't do it alone, Bette. I need you to promise me you'll see it through, even after I'm gone, especially after I'm gone." The promise Bette made in that moment would define the rest of her life. But what she didn't know was that Johnny had already set in motion events that would test that promise in ways she couldn't imagine. Bette didn't hesitate. She grabbed both of his hands and squeezed hard enough to hurt. "I promise," she said, her voice fierce and broken at the same time. "I swear to you, Johnny, I'll protect this. I'll make it grow. I'll make sure Rick's memory saves lives for generations. I won't let you down. I won't let him down. That promise, made in a dressing room in Burbank, while the rest of Studio One celebrated the end of an era, changed everything. For Bette, it became the defining mission of her life, more important than any movie or album or performance. For the next 13 years, until Johnny's passing in 2005, she served as the secret liaison between him and the foundation. She made decisions about which programs to fund. She visited the hospital regularly to check on the children and meet with the medical staff. She protected Johnny's anonymity with fierce dedication, never once hinting publicly about what he was doing with his fortune. When friends asked why she traveled to Los Angeles so often, she invented excuses. When reporters asked what she was working on between projects, she smiled and changed the subject. She became a guardian of the secret, and the secret became her purpose. But Johnny had one more surprise waiting, something he'd planned that would only be revealed after his passing. And when Bette finally learned about it, she'd understand just how carefully he'd orchestrated everything. When Johnny departed in January 2005, his will shocked the entertainment industry. He left the bulk of his $400 million estate to a children's medical foundation that most people had never heard of. The press scrambled to understand where this foundation had come from and why Johnny had made this choice. Entertainment Tonight ran specials. People magazine put it on the cover. Everyone wanted to know the story behind Johnny Carson's secret fortune. That's when Bette finally told the truth, honoring the promise she'd made in that dressing room 13 years earlier. She held a press conference that was broadcast live on multiple networks, and for the first time, she revealed everything. The grief over Rick, the 2 years of secret operation before Johnny's retirement, the playroom and the jokes and the 43 children saved in those first 2 years. The promise she'd made on his final night. She told the world about the whisper, about the 12 words that had changed both of their lives. I'm giving it all away. Please help me do it right. But here's what made the revelation even more powerful. Bette had receipts. She had documents. She had letters from families. She had proof of every single thing Johnny had done in secret. Bette explained that Johnny hadn't wanted credit while he was alive because he couldn't bear to have his grief turned into a story or his son's loss turned into a branding opportunity. But he'd wanted the foundation to outlive him, to grow into something that would save thousands of lives. And he'd trusted Bette to make sure that happened. He'd trusted her to wait until he was gone and then tell the story in a way that would inspire others to give. The revelation transformed Johnny's legacy overnight. The man America had known as the King of Late Night became something more. He became a symbol of grief, transformed into grace, of private pain channeled into public good. Within 48 hours of Bette's press conference, the foundation received over $50 million in donations from people who wanted to honor Johnny's memory. The foundation's donations skyrocketed beyond anyone's predictions. Major corporations wanted to partner with an organization that bore Johnny Carson's name and mission. Within 5 years of his passing, the endowment had grown to over $1 billion. Within 10 years, the foundation had funded treatment for more than 8,000 children who would have lost their lives without intervention. But the number that would have meant the most to Johnny was this: 0. That's how many children were turned away due to inability to pay at the partner hospitals. 0. Because of Johnny's initial gift and the endowment it created, every single child who needed treatment got treatment. No questions asked. No families bankrupted. No parents forced to choose between their child's life and financial ruin. Bette became the public face Johnny never could be, traveling the country to speak about pediatric healthcare and the importance of ensuring every child has access to life-saving treatment regardless of their parents' ability to pay. She told Johnny's story at every event, making sure people understood that behind the jokes and the celebrity was a father who'd lost everything that mattered and chosen to make that loss count for something. She showed audiences photos of the circus playroom, now expanded to 3 times its original size and replicated in 17 hospitals across the country. She read some of Johnny's jokes that children still discovered on index cards scattered throughout the hospitals, his humor still making sick kids laugh decades after he passed away. She introduced families whose children were alive because of Johnny's gift, letting them tell their stories in their own words. and she revealed something Johnny had done that she'd promised to keep secret until 10 years after his passing, something that showed just how deeply he'd planned his legacy. Years later, when Bette was finally allowed to open a sealed envelope Johnny's lawyers had given her, she discovered that Johnny had established a second, even larger endowment. This one was designed to fund medical research into the diseases that take the most children's lives: cancer, heart defects, genetic disorders. He'd set aside $100 million specifically for research, money that wouldn't be touched until 10 years after his passing, to allow the treatment foundation to establish itself first. That $100 million, invested wisely for 10 years, had grown to over $200 million by the time it was released. The research fund has since contributed to breakthroughs in pediatric cancer treatment, funded clinical trials that led to FDA approvals of new medications, and supported research that has increased survival rates for several childhood diseases. Johnny had thought of everything. He'd planned for decades into the future, ensuring his fortune would continue saving children long after anyone remembered his show. When Bette was asked in an interview about that final night with Johnny, about what it felt like to receive that whisper and understand the weight of what he was asking, she paused for a long moment before answering. Her eyes filled with tears even though it had been years since Johnny departed. "Johnny spent 30 years making sure everyone else was okay," she finally said. "He tucked America into bed every night with a smile. But when his own world fell apart, he had no one to tuck him in." That whisper wasn't just him asking for help. It was him finally admitting he couldn't carry it alone anymore. And the fact that he trusted me with that? It's the greatest honor of my life. She explained that people often ask her what Johnny was really like, whether the private man matched the public persona. The question always made her smile through tears. "Johnny was exactly who you think he was," she said. "Smart, funny, kind, private. But what you didn't see was how deeply he felt everything. How much he cared. He couldn't save his own son, and that knowledge was ending him from the inside. The only thing that kept him breathing after Rick was lost was knowing he could save someone else's son, someone else's daughter. That foundation wasn't charity to Johnny. It was survival." The hospital where Johnny's foundation does most of its work now has an entire wing named after Rick Carson. Johnny had specifically requested this in his will, the one place where his son's name would be publicly honored in perpetuity. Inside that wing is the circus playroom, now called Rick's Room, where children undergoing treatment can forget about being sick for an hour and just be kids. On the wall is a photograph of Johnny and Rick from 1985. Both of them laughing at something off camera, frozen in a moment before everything fell apart. Below the photograph is a plaque with a quote from Johnny's will. "Every child who laughs in this room is my son laughing again. That's all I ever wanted." Pa. Bette visits Rick's room several times a year, and every visit feels like keeping a promise to an old friend. She watches children perform magic tricks on the little stage Johnny designed. She hands out the index cards with jokes he wrote, still being printed exactly as he created them decades ago. She sees parents whose children are alive because of the foundation Johnny built from his grief, and she remembers the look on his face that final night when he whispered those 12 words. The desperation, the hope, the trust. She remembers thinking in that moment that she was witnessing something sacred, a transformation of pain into purpose that would outlive both of them. She'd been right. The foundation has now outlived Johnny by almost 2 decades, and it's stronger than ever. The foundation now operates in 17 states and has funded treatment for more than 12,000 children. It's grown far beyond what Johnny could have imagined that night in his dressing room, but Bette insists that every decision is made through the lens of what he would have wanted. We ask ourselves, what would Johnny do? She explains. And the answer is always the same. Save the kid. Do whatever it takes. No press releases. No publicity stunts. Just save the kid and move on to the next one. That philosophy has made the foundation one of the most respected pediatric healthcare charities in America, known for actually delivering results, rather than spending money on overhead and marketing. 94 cents of every dollar donated goes directly to patient care. That's almost unheard of in the nonprofit world. but it's exactly what Johnny demanded in the founding documents. When Bette turned 70, she was asked if she planned to step back from her work with the foundation. She looked genuinely confused by the question, as if the interviewer had asked her if she planned to stop breathing. "I made Johnny a promise," she said firmly. "You don't break a promise to someone who trusted you with their whole heart. I'll be doing this work until I can't do it anymore, and then I'll make sure someone else picks it up who understands what it means. This isn't a job, it's a mission. It's how I honor the greatest man I ever knew." That's what those 12 words changed. They changed Bette from an entertainer into an advocate. They changed Johnny's legacy from jokes and late-night television into something that saves actual lives every single day. They changed the way we think about grief and wealth and what we owe to each other when we have the power to help. Most importantly, they changed the trajectory of thousands of families who will never know their children were saved by a man who couldn't save his own son but refused to let that pain be meaningless. The next time you see a clip of Johnny Carson's final show, watch the moment when Bette leans in close and his lips move near her ear. Watch her face transform. Watch her hand fly to her mouth. Watch the tears start to fall. Now you know what that moment really was. It wasn't just a goodbye between friends. It wasn't just emotion and nostalgia and the end of an era. It was the exact second when one of the most famous men in America handed his entire fortune and his entire legacy to someone he trusted and asked her to make his son's passing mean something. It was a father channeling unbearable grief into undeniable grace. It was a man who'd spent 30 years hiding behind a desk, finally revealing his whole heart. "I'm giving it all away. Please help me do it right." 12 words. $400 million. 12,000 lives saved and counting. Children who are alive today because Johnny Carson turned his greatest loss into his greatest gift. That's what Johnny Carson whispered to Bette Midler on his final night. And that's why it changed everything. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe, because we bring you the hidden truths behind the legends you love. And there are dozens more stories like this waiting for you.